Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. The Facts of Death is Raymond Benson's third James Bond novel. That is, of course, if you're counting the novelization of Tomorrow Never Dies in the run, and I, of course, do. The Facts of Death was first published in May 1998. The paperback edition that I have here is comprised of 274 pages, and my god, is a heck of a lot of story crammed into those 274 pages. The £5.99p it would have cost you to buy this in the UK brand new in 1998 would have been money very well spent, I should say. I've been watching and reading a lot of Raymond Benson interviews now that I'm firmly into his era of Bond stories, and I was very interested to see this quote from a really terrific interview with John Cox for CommanderBond.net regarding this particular book. I'll leave the link to the full interview below, but this is the quote from Benson himself. "I think The Facts of Death is my most Eon-like novel. I purposely set out to write something that felt like a Bond movie with that one." Which totally rings true for me with The Facts of Death. There were times when I was reading this that I felt like I was reading a novelization of a Bond movie that doesn't actually exist. And that's true right from the off. The story begins with a proper kind of James Bond pre-title sequence bit of action. It feels almost like the front cover, the title of the book could have been placed like after chapter 1. And even before the big like action of chapter 1, there is this intriguing prologue in which we're seeing the early stages of this epidemic breaking out and people are dying, and then we move to Cyprus where Bond is investigating a mass murder. A bunch of military men have been killed and the killer or killers have left behind a statue and a number written on the wall. This all escalates into a full-blown action sequence with Bond chasing the assassin and he's clinging to the underside of a getaway helicopter. Benson's action sequences just continue to be super fun and exciting, and I found this a really adrenalizing way to begin this particular story. And then the plot moves to London and we have a few very intriguing chapters here. It's not your typical Bond goes into M's office and gets his mission briefing. So the old M, Sir Miles Mesavie, is, well, I mean, firstly, he's still alive, but secondly, he's hosting a dinner party, and he invites a bunch of current MI6 staff along, including Tanner and Bond, and the current M, who brings along with her new boyfriend, a man by the name of Alfred Hutchinson, who is the goodwill ambassador for Britain. So I really loved all of this dinner party and M's boyfriend stuff. I really felt that the awkwardness of the situation was really well conveyed. There are some really nice moments in this book dealing with Bond and the current M when her personal life is becoming involved in the plot and how it's weaved into the story, and just the balance between them being boss and employee and the formality that comes with that, but then her personal life and emotions factoring into things in a few places and how that makes certain situations kind of awkward for Bond, I thought was really well explored throughout this whole story. And we also get a name for M in this book, Barbara. So prior to even reading Benson's stories, I knew of the name Barbara Maudsley, and I knew that that was M's name in these stories because I'd seen it mentioned on fan sites and stuff, because I guess that when I was 10 years old and I was searching Bond questions online, you can bet that one of the first things I was searching for was, what is M's real name? And it's astonishing, I think, that of all the names in the world, Benson landed on just the exact, like, the most perfect name imaginable for Judi Dench's M. A more Barbara Maudsley looking woman has never before existed or will again. I can't articulate enough just how much that name works for this version of the character. I know that in the rebooted Craig era, the character was given the name Olivia Mansfield. You can see it on one of the props, but I don't want anything to do with Olivia Mansfield. Barbara Maudsley is a name that transcends timelines as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, if Barbara thought introducing her new boyfriend to her current employees was awkward, well, her night gets worse as he is assassinated, and then she needs to bring in her employees to investigate his assassination. Bond has to investigate the who, what, why of all this, and how this all links together with a deadly virus, and also a plot to stoke a war between Greece and Turkey. That's the main jumping off point for the plot. So the main villainous organization that Bond is up against in this story are called the Decada, and these are a vegetarian, robe-wearing mathematic cult that worships Pythagoras, and the first port of call on Bond's investigation is a sperm bank in Texas. Now, just to call this out up front, like, reading out some of these details, I know how crazy some of this sounds, and indeed, I was nervous that the train I was riding on had been hijacked and rerouted back to John Gardner Crazy Town when I was initially reading some of these plot details. Gardner did the whole villainous cult thing at least a couple of times, and so when I realised that a cult was going to be the villains of this particular story, it did put my back up a bit, and then at one point neo-Nazis are even mentioned, and that put my back up so much that I'm having to get the decorators in to fix up the crack in the ceiling that I've left behind. I'm very happy to report, though, for as crazy as some of these plot details sound, and indeed are, I do think that Benson has a real knack for making these things work. Like, every time I felt myself teetering on the edge of, is this a bit too much, he'd pull it back with some exciting development or a really fun sequence, and that's the key thing here. Like, you know, all of this, you know, outlandishness and ridiculousness, I'm having fun throughout the whole thing. But yeah, the sperm bank thing was interesting. It's the first proper bit of jet setting that Bond does in this story, and he goes to Texas where he meets with Felix Leiter, who has a new girlfriend, and they're aiding Bond in his investigation. And of course, it's James Bond in a sperm clinic. There's a lot of funny lines and innuendos peppered throughout, and I thought that the tonal balance here was just right. You don't want the gags to be so ridiculous that it feels like you're reading a novelization for a carry-on film, but at the same time you want a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, because it's James Bond in a sperm bank. You've got to have a bit of fun in that scenario, and I just felt that the level of winking at the reader was placed just perfectly. I also thought it was interesting that Bond's in Texas here, just reading, you know, like I say in the interviews that I've been reading and watching with Raymond Benson, he's born in Texas, so I love that he was able to take the character there, and hey, we even get a nod back to John Gardner's For Special Services, where Bond, you know, Bond visited Texas in that story, and if you'll remember, that was the one where Bond battled Blofeld's daughter and her mind control ice cream plot. And on a similar note regarding the referencing, much of the second half of the book takes place in and around Greece and Cyprus and Turkey, and Bond having previously had adventures there in Colonel Sun, which is of course mentioned, and I'm not going to spoil the exact details of this specific reference, but there's a really lovely little detail that connects back to Kerim Bey in From Russia With Love, which I thought was a really lovely little surprise, and again, I can't fault Benson's knack for referencing. Though surprisingly, just on the whole film literary continuity thing, there is a full-on Q branch scene in this story again, but unlike 0-10, where the character giving the briefing was just referred to as Q, here he's very much Major Boothroyd, which is what I'm kind of used to him being referred to as in most of these Bond books. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because I just assumed from the first story and from the Tomorrow Never Dies novelization that the character was just going to become known as Q from here on, but no, he's Major Boothroyd again. Anyway, the main villain scheme, though it kind of ends up being a two-pronged villain scheme in this one, it comes down to stoking a war between Greece and Turkey, and then there's this whole epidemic, this virus that's going around the world, and again, much like 0-10, I felt like I was learning a lot about real-world politics, much like I was learning about the Hong Kong British rule situation in that book. In this book, I feel like I learned an awful lot about Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, the whole conflict in that region. Like, you know, excuse my ignorance, but it was an element of world history that I didn't really know all that much about until reading this book. There were a few bits in this story, too, that really did unlock things that I thought I'd forgotten about my English comprehensive school education regarding my maths. Like, you know, because the villains are obsessed with Pythagoras, and Bond even has to solve a Pythagoras-related question at some point, and all of this mathematics stuff that I thought I'd long forgotten is apparently buried away in the back of my brain somewhere. I was experiencing my GCSE maths lessons like a form of PTSD when I was reading this. In terms of villains and Bond girls, there are plenty of characters in this story, and there are a good few surprises and twists throughout, and until the last few chapters, I had no idea how some of these convergent plot lines were going to come together. So there's this virus thing going around, there's nuclear missiles, there's mention of illegal gold trafficking, and then there's the fact whether or not M has compromised herself due to her entanglement with a man connected to all of this plotting. I think it comes together in a really satisfying way, but there is one villainous character that really stood out for me. Her name is Hera Volopoulos, and just flat out, she's one of my favourite literary Bond villains to date. She is just such a hellish delight in this story. There's a bit in the book that very much reminded me of the Bond and Helga scene in You Only Live Twice, where Bond is tied down and the villainess has a knife, and in this story, Hera is telling Bond about what she's gonna do with it and how she's gonna torture him, and it had me wincing like nobody's business. It really got to me, that passage. So interestingly, the final chapter of the book is called The World Is Not Enough, and Benson actually wanted to use that as the full-on title of this book, but the publishers rejected it. Here's a segment from the CommanderBond.net interview where he talks about it. Would you believe that Glidrose and both publishers didn't like the title? They thought it wasn't Bondian? Go figure. I secretly enjoyed the irony of all that when Eon came to produce their film titled, surprise surprise, The World Is Not Enough. I ended up using the title as a chapter title in the book. Peter came up with The Facts of Death. I rather like that title. It's very Fleming-esque in my opinion. And I agree with Benson there. I think that The Facts of Death is a really great title, and I may be kind of happy that things worked out the way that they did. Bond's family motto is still present in the text of the book. He still cites the motto in that last chapter, so to call the whole book that would have been justified in the context of the story, but I don't know, I like the title better as it relates to the Eon movie. With the story there being so much about the villain feeling like she's doing something related to her family's legacy and all that, and Bond's family motto in relation to that plot fits really nicely thematically for me, and I don't know if it fits as well into The Facts of Death, but it would have been pretty fun if Benson had been allowed to use the title and he called this book The World Is Not Enough, and then the next Eon film was also going to be called that, and then Benson would have to have done a novelization of The World Is Not Enough, which would take place 2 books after his own version of The World Is Not Enough. So I'm 3 for 3 with Benson at the moment. I thought that this was another super fun, really engaging read. I think that Benson absolutely accomplished his goal when he set out to write a Bond story that felt like one of the Eon Bond films. It's full of action, surprises, humor, and like I said earlier, it feels like a novelization of a Bond movie that doesn't exist, and that's perhaps the highest compliment I can give it. And for a few moments and plot details that had me harkening back to some of the crazier John Gardner stories, Benson just has such a knack for keeping it fun and keeping it interesting and keeping me guessing like how things are going to pan out. I mean, the stuff that I became annoyed with in some of the later John Gardner novels, like villainous double crossings and stuff like that, those things in Benson's hands work really well, and just same as with the previous Benson books. Right now I'm just super keen to get my teeth into the next one. Let me know what you think about The Facts of Death in the comments section below. Also below you can click the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay up to date on future video uploads, and with all that being said, until next time Bond fans, so long for now.